So as I mentioned before, we're trying to do sort of focused discussions about specific industries. There is a lot of overlap between some of the applications and the way that the technology works within many of these industries. And that's why I'm holding for the Q&A at the end, because I'd like to have the perspective of the entire panel address the questions that come from the audience. But for now, we're going to move on to smart cities. So as you think about introducing yourselves, for some, when you think about a smart city, it's about governments and city planners trying to pull together efficiencies within the government and planning of efficiently deploying things using data and analytics and so on. Excuse me. But for others, it's about the experience in the smart city. And so as a part of your introduction for yourselves, could you work towards an opening question that's around, is there a conflict between what the city government may want out of a smart city and what businesses, residents, and visitors may want out of a smart city? Is that in conflict, or is that in partnership with each other? And I'll go ahead and start with you, Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Barboni. I'm VP of Customer Engineering at Gimbal. We've been doing Bluetooth Low Energy beacons since Bluetooth Low Energy has existed. So we were some of the first, if not the first, for the large-scale commercialized deployments. We've been doing that very successfully now for many years. Interestingly enough, I really agree with some of your points on kind of what a smart city is. I'd also say it's very much about what it has been and maybe what it becomes. I'd say Bluetooth in that space specifically has been limited by range previously. And so a lot of the use cases that we have focused on have been around services that have been made to residents. So one of the slides that you had earlier literally was a recipe of my current customers up there for sure. But stadiums, as an example. We've used a lot of Bluetooth Low Energy for experiences. And so in stadiums, that was one of the very, very early, if not earliest use case, trying to help people understand what was available to them in that environment. Retail, the other earliest use case, trying to help people understand when their experience needs to change, even if it's inside of an application, as they move from the difference of being on your couch versus being in store. There's different things you want out of your applications in those scenarios, and we used Bluetooth in order to enable that. And we also found that in many cases there were these, cities really didn't understand what they wanted to do. They had residents demanding technology. They had residents demanding more particular and advanced services, but in many cases they just weren't equipped to be able to provide it. And so I do very much agree that in those areas, we've been able to do things in retail, in out-of-home, in advertising, in stadiums, sports teams. We've also done a lot in asset tracking, though ironically in cities, it's been more people tracking to an extent. Not tracking the people themselves, but trying to understand where they are so that we can better expose or help our vendors and partners expose services to those residents of those cities.
Okay. Ken?
Hi, Chuck. Yeah, hi, I'm Ken Figueiredo with Cordant, an interdigital business, and I focus very much on IoT ecosystems in industrial internet and smart cities. To your question about conflict, let me just step back a bit and say, if you're a city leader, you have a big problem. Everybody's talking about smart cities. There are huge expectations for rolling out new services. You don't have the expertise, and you probably don't have a lot of budget kicking around. But you have to do something. So how do you tackle that? Particularly when there are hundreds, if not thousands, of smart city applications out there. So a concept that's starting to emerge, because you don't have a lot of money, because you don't have a lot of expertise, and you need to work together, private-public partnerships, experts from lots of different sectors, is to think about the smart city platform as an environment. And within that environment, cities and public sector service providers can put data in. They are the data providers. Application developers and end-user service providers can come in and pull on that data to build applications, smart city applications. And the beauty of having this environment is that you're not constraining it to one application. You can do smart waste, you can do utilities, you can do lighting, because it has to be multi-purpose if it's going to survive and exist 10, 20, 30 years from now. So that idea of an environment, we talk about that as a data marketplace, because a data marketplace allows you to put data in and sell it, right? Everyone talks about making money out of data, but it's not enough just to have a technical environment. You need an environment with commercial policies, legal and licensing policies. And so that's essentially what we as a company do. We work on that marketplace environment. We started thinking about this in 2013. We've done a 2-year trial that we've just finished with 5 local government and city agencies. So these are 5 essentially customers putting all of their data into one common environment. So there's a huge degree of collaboration and cooperation. And then there's a bunch of companies that specialize in smart city or transport telematics coming in and using that data to build applications. And so that 2-year trial has now just finished, and we've transitioned it into a commercial offering, initially in the UK. So just to close on the issue of conflict, it's not so much conflict as much as having different expectations. City residents want to go in one direction, local businesses want to go in another direction. City authorities, and within a city authority you have multiple operational units, each of them wants to go in a different direction. And the idea of a common environment where everybody can collaborate is a way of unifying those different directions of thinking and really starting to enable smart cities, not just for the next 1 or 2 years, but 10, 20 years down the road.
Yeah.
Okay, Dom?
Okay, thank you, Chuck. So my name is Dom Bonte. I work for a global technology market research company, ABI Research, based out of New York. We cover a lot of technologies. I'm responsible for end markets and verticals, among which smart cities is a very important one. So we look at business cases, monetization schemes. How do the implementers look at technology as opposed to the supply chain dynamics? So, as opposed to your question about the conflict, I do get the impression when I talk to CIOs at cities that they're more concerned about keeping their infrastructure alive. Infrastructure which in developed countries might be a century old. Think about the road network, the water distribution, the energy grid. So it's really their first priority to use technology to reduce maintenance costs using predictive kind of, for example, water leak detection is an important thing. And they're so focused on keeping that infrastructure, up and running, that they forget to think about what that same technology could do in terms of help people save water or help them save energy. And I think, it's kind of they're working on the invisible part of a smart city, the behind the scenes part, the infrastructure part, and of course the citizens are kind of more seeing the interaction they can have with governments. And I think that's where I think Bluetooth and other wireless technology can play a big role. I can imagine that you could look at, for example, one interesting application I heard from Denmark is that, not just doing environmental sensing, air quality sensing for, keeping a tab on what is going, but they're actually closing the loop, rerouting traffic if they see that air quality goes down around schools. So I think that's a good example of using technology in a way that immediately benefits the end users. I can think of other cases such as transit, putting beacons in buses, which allow, for example, visually impaired people to be informed about the arrival of their bus in a very reliable way. I can think about the kiosks that can have a Bluetooth, maybe push type notification. And when they go near a kiosk, they can be informed about relevant information. It's also about digital inclusion. Not everybody has a sophisticated smartphone or knows how to use it. So I think beacons and Bluetooth can kind of make it more frictionless, more accessible, more seamless in terms of governments communicating with their citizens.
Yeah. Well, I think the reason I asked that question about the about the two juxtapositions of a smart city is you hear people say, well, maybe I want to participate in the smart city, smart city, the idea of a smart city, but I don't want to have to work with the government. I don't want to have to work with with the local municipalities, et cetera. So, can businesses work together to create a vision for a smart city without the need for partnering specific with the city and the government, or is a partnership required in order to realize some of these visions of what a smart city can actually be?
I can take it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think there's a big need for these public-private partnerships. Let's take the example of ride-sharing. And I heard mayors say that Uber has done more for their cities than they have been able to do in the past 10 years in terms of impact on mobility, pricing of mobility. But that's not the whole story. To make sure that private companies deliver mobility in unsafe areas, in poor neighborhoods, disadvantaged communities, they need to be incentivized to do that. Nowadays, Uber doesn't go in those areas so much. So I think it's about leveraging, taking advantage of the sharing economy, while at the same time making sure that service is available for all the citizens, rich and poor, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just one example, I think, how cities can have quick wins by working together with private companies.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit to that. We've definitely done some public-private partnership work in the past, and even some of the very early projects that we did. I'm not sure the word quick is what comes to mind.
Okay.
It definitely is something where there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of process that goes along with it. There's always time for budgets. The money has to come from somewhere, and in most cases, the cities don't have the money to spend, and they don't want to tax their residents more. And so my experience, at least, has been that they definitely take more time, but they definitely create, eventually, a much larger, kind of more inclusive and complete solution that benefits all of the residents. What I do see, in the meantime, is that there's a lot of business already happening in the cities, and those companies and brands especially are able to move very, very quickly. In many cases, they're competing with others. They're trying to solve problems that are impacting their businesses. And I'll agree with one of the last panelists too. ROI has been one of the biggest things that has been a challenge for them to understand. And as they really think about the problems that they're trying to solve, they've been able to find some very quick wins that have saved them a lot of money or increased brand awareness or loyalty in a very, very, we're talking 3 to 6 month scenario versus a multi-year scenario for most of the larger public-private partnership efforts.
Just a final observation. I would say if you want to start quickly, you can start in the private sector, but on your roadmap, you have to have some involvement with the city, because the city is going to get involved from a regulatory point of view, but the city also owns access to unique assets and unique data sets that will improve your applications. So you have to factor that into your roadmap at some point.
Okay. Does wireless help? So if there is this bridging that needs to happen in public-private relationships, does wireless change that dynamic and maybe allow for some of the private deployment and then the work with the city, because you're not necessarily impacting the infrastructure as much and not impacting what they may have already put into the infrastructure? Yeah.
I think that can be challenging. As soon as you're dealing with wireless and where you're dealing with devices and connected devices, you are dealing with costs of deployment. And so most businesses that we've worked with are more interested in owning that infrastructure and leveraging it as a competitive advantage, unless there's been some other way that they're going to benefit from it. So we do see some of those businesses then finding, in many cases, it's for public good or other sorts of services. We have one example, we have using some of our really small coin cell beacons, and they provide those beacons out to the homeless in the city. And it allows people through a publicly funded, driven app in order to donate money to homeless people that they're walking by real time. Sometimes there's things like that will come up that are sponsored, or in some cases, an infrastructure deployment that can offer some sort of public good in that regard. Sometimes it's negotiated in advance. through some sort of city arrangement, or in many cases, it may be based on the location of that infrastructure. Sometimes there's a lease or an easement or something else that goes along with the deal.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. So I think there's indeed a problem that cities don't have the money to engage in mega projects. And I think that's where wireless can come into play. And especially Bluetooth, I would say. If you think about the peer-to-peer kind of mode, you don't need backhaul. You know, the example I gave about buses, you know, the only thing that's happening is that the bus announces its arrival to whoever wants to take that bus. You don't need any backhaul for that. So it does allow to very much offer services without any further investments there. So it's kind of a layer sitting on top of, you know, kind of more fundamental infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for cities to start doing things today, demonstrating the benefits for the citizens, and then little by little, step by step, engaging in more fundamental deployments where, you know, there is a need for CapEx investments. But taking it step by step, especially for smaller cities, I think is very important.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to be slightly controversial. Firstly, everything's going wireless, pretty much, okay? But the challenge is you have to deal with a number of different wireless access technologies, right? So that's pretty much a given. But on the flip side, I would say when you look at some of these smart city services, you also think about stuff that's not coming in off a wireless endpoint. So cities have data in Excel. If there's a crew digging up a street and they want to tell you they're running 2 hours late, that's coming in on a sheet of paper, right? So when you're thinking about smart city applications, you have to deal or anticipate a huge number of access media, right? So in our work that I was talking about, you know, we were playing around with about 300 different types of data asset, and each of those had a different kind of access technology. You know, lots of Bluetooth, but also lots of cellular, some coming from enterprise resource systems, and some coming in on bits of Excel or sheets of paper.
Just another example on how Bluetooth can reduce costs and make it easier is traffic management. So traditionally, cities would embed loops into the road service at junctions to measure traffic. You can do the same with roadside beacons. There's companies at TrafficCast International is just one example. There's others as well. It's a faster way, a cheaper way to start measuring traffic and make that information available to the citizens as well. So another great use case how wireless and Bluetooth in particular can make them advance a lot faster.
Well, maybe that's a good bridge to another question around, you know, how are beacons and the whole idea of beacons and broadcasting, is that changing what's possible for the smart city? Is it getting people thinking about different things that maybe they hadn't thought about before?
Yes.
In what areas then?
At our heart, we're a location services platform that's massively scalable. And while we provide most of our services to applications, and maybe this is kind of the odd thing to think about in a smart city scenario, the best thing our Bluetooth beacons have done in large-scale cities is fill the void left by GPS. GPS does not work well in large-scale cities with tall buildings and urban canyons. There isn't enough line of sight. They try to aid with Wi-Fi access points in order to get core location capabilities to be more accurate, but it's still not good enough. Most of our large-scale deployments inside of cities in those cases are about trying to better understand location. And if you think about understanding more accurate location, and you guys can see this, if you're in a big city, or maybe you're catching an Uber or a Lyft or something like that, how often are you on the wrong block when it tries to figure out where you're at? It happens when you come out of the airport terminal, anywhere you're indoors. That's probably the number one thing that I think is driving our customers to think about new and interesting things to do, because understanding location at that micro of a level has enabled use cases that, even 4 years ago we weren't thinking about. And each month there's something super interesting that's coming up. We've done some of the forget what they call it, I apologize, but from people that are impaired in various ways, especially visually impaired and on transit and making that available at that micro of location. I mean, interesting that the biggest problem that solved was not what bus was arriving, but which direction to turn when they got off the bus. And I think location really is something that's driving those use cases more than anything else.
So the transit example can actually scale to the ride-sharing use cases as well, because it's kind of an additional reliability that you can enable people, and in the sharing economy that's critical, interaction between participants in the sharing economy, and Bluetooth can bring that additional layer of reliability and remove the concerns about will I see my Uber or Lyft arrive or not. It's not unimportant to add that layer of accuracy and reliability, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Just to close things out. So we've talked a little bit about the role of the city, the role of private businesses, and so on. So as you think about, you sort of at a higher level of what's going to make the smart city really start up and sort of kick off. Do you think private businesses are leading the way, or is it the government that's leading the way?
It depends on the region, I think.
Okay.
Europe has been known for public-private partnerships, EU spending a lot of money subsidizing smart city deployments. US has been more private investment, supplier ecosystem, although that might be changing as we move forward. I think China, Asia is very much government-driven.
Okay.
So I think it really varies. I do, however, think that the public-private partnership paradigm is starting to spread across the globe as, nothing is just private and nothing is just public. It always has to be a cooperation. So it's a paradigm that's gaining momentum, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that geographical characterization. I sense also that we're on the cusp of a transition where cities are starting to think, actually, we have to be very careful about building point solutions because it's uneconomic, and we need to think about how we can support tens, hundreds, if not thousands of solutions. And that thinking is starting to emerge through a lot of the innovation funding that you see in Europe and the US now.
I'd also echo the same, but I'd also think that some of the larger market forces are what are causing businesses to take more interest and cities to take more interest. And what I mean by that are things like, we take for granted our mobile phones as we're all sitting here in this audience, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of people that have not had mobile phones to date, and that certainly is regional in many cases. But the other thing that goes along with that is you're not as desperate to find a Wi-Fi hotspot anymore. You're more connected more often, and I feel like that drives an expectation of services from cities, municipalities, and the like, of a new and interesting experience in various areas of your life. And I think we find those experiences being in that connected world what are truly driving people to invest because they see the ROI. And the cities are having to deal with expectations of services in order to try and facilitate things that maybe they haven't had to reinvent in a long time. And I think we've seen a lot of traction coming from business as a result.
Great. Well, I'm going to hold it for here, and thank you very much for your time on the Smart City discussion. We will have you back up for Q&A with the rest of the audience.
Thanks.
So at this time, I want to thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.